Picture this. You're sitting in your living room on a peaceful Tuesday morning when suddenly, flashing red and blue lights flood through your windows. Again. For the 12th time in 6 months, police cars are pulling into your driveway. The neighbors are peeking through their curtains, whispering among themselves, and you already know exactly what this is about before the officers even step out of their patrol cars. Your American flag, yes, you heard that right. The same stars and stripes that brave men and women have died defending. The symbol of freedom that flies proudly over government buildings, schools, and countless homes across this great nation. Someone in your neighborhood, someone who's supposed to be your neighbor, your community member, has called the police on you for displaying the American flag on your own property. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most absurd, infuriating, and ultimately satisfying stories of HOA overreach you've ever heard. This isn't just about a flag. This is about what happens when petty power goes completely off the rails, when common sense gets thrown out the window, and when one person's obsession with control turns an entire community into a battleground. What you're about to discover will shock you, make your blood boil, and ultimately restore your faith in the power of standing up to bullies. Because this story doesn't end the way the HOA Karen thought it would. Meet Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old nurse who thought she was making the smart choice when she bought her dream home in Willowbrook Estates, a seemingly perfect suburban community just outside Denver, Colorado. After years of saving and searching, Sarah finally found what appeared to be the ideal neighborhood. Well-maintained lawns, friendly faces, and reasonable HOA fees that promise to keep property values high and community standards intact. Sarah was not just any homeowner, she was a proud American with deep roots in service to her country. Her father had served 2 tours in Vietnam, her brother was currently deployed overseas with the Marines, and she herself had spent countless hours volunteering at the VA hospital, caring for veterans who had sacrificed so much for their country. The American flag wasn't just a decoration to Sarah. It was a symbol of everything her family stood for, everything they had fought to protect. When she moved into her modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street in March of 2023, one of the first things Sarah did was install a beautiful flagpole in her front yard. She followed every protocol she could think of. She checked the city ordinances, she reviewed the HOA guidelines, and she even consulted with the previous homeowner who assured her that flag displays had never been an issue in the neighborhood. The flagpole was elegant and understated. A 20-foot white aluminum pole positioned respectfully near the front walkway, not blocking anyone's view or interfering with traffic sight lines. Sarah took pride in maintaining it properly, following flag etiquette to the letter, raising it at dawn, lowering it at dusk, never letting it touch the ground, and replacing it immediately whenever the weather took its toll. For the first few months, everything was perfect. Neighbors would wave as they walked their dogs past her house. Kids riding bikes would sometimes stop to look up at the flag fluttering in the breeze. Sarah felt like she had truly found her place in the world, a community where she could put down roots and build a life. But every paradise has its serpent, and Willowbrook Estates was no exception. Enter Margaret Pemberton, the 58-year-old self-appointed guardian of Willowbrook's aesthetic standards. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and had held various positions on the HOA board during that time. Currently serving as the Architectural Review Committee chairperson, Margaret took her role very seriously, perhaps too seriously. Margaret was the type of person who measured grass height with a ruler, who knew exactly which shade of beige was acceptable for mailbox posts, and who could spot an unauthorized garden gnome from 3 houses away. She lived in the largest house on the most prominent corner lot, a sprawling Tudor-style mansion that she kept immaculate down to the last detail. Her own yard was a masterpiece of rigid perfection, geometrically trimmed hedges, flowers planted in military straight rows, and not a single blade of grass out of place. To understand Margaret's mindset, you need to understand her background. She had inherited her house from her wealthy parents and had never worked a traditional job. Instead, she had spent decades perfecting the art of homemaker's activism, serving on school boards, organizing charity galas, and most importantly, maintaining what she called community standards. Margaret genuinely believed that she was protecting everyone's property values and quality of life, but somewhere along the way, that noble intention had twisted into something much darker. The first sign of trouble came on a sunny Saturday morning in June. Sarah was in her garden tending to the roses she had planted along the front border when she noticed Margaret approaching with a clipboard and a very serious expression. Margaret introduced herself with all the warmth of a tax auditor and immediately launched into what she called a neighborly conversation about community guidelines. But even as Margaret spoke about welcome committees and community events, Sarah could see her eyes constantly drifting to the flagpole. There was something about the way Margaret looked at it, not with the respect or indifference you might expect, but with barely concealed irritation. Margaret made several pointed comments about maintaining the historic character of the neighborhood and ensuring that all installations comply with aesthetic guidelines. Sarah, being naturally diplomatic and wanting to maintain good relationships with her neighbors, listened politely and assured Margaret that she was committed to being a good community member. She mentioned her background, her family's military service, and her pride in displaying the flag. She thought this would help Margaret understand the personal significance of what some might see as just a piece of fabric on a pole. She was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to notice Margaret walking past her house more frequently than seemed normal. Sometimes Margaret would pause at the end of the driveway, appearing to take notes or photos on her phone. Other times, Sarah would catch glimpses of Margaret's distinctive silver BMW slowing down as it passed the house, with Margaret craning her neck to get a better look at the flagpole. It was becoming clear that Margaret had developed what could only be described as an obsession with Sarah's American flag. But Sarah had no idea just how deep that obsession would go, or how far Margaret would be willing to push her crusade against what she had apparently decided was a violation of her vision for the perfect neighborhood. The stage was set for a conflict that would divide the community, involve law enforcement, and ultimately expose the dark side of HOA power when it falls into the wrong hands. Sarah thought she was displaying her patriotism and honoring her family's service. She had no idea she was about to become the target of one woman's increasingly unhinged campaign to control every aspect of her neighbors' lives. What happened next would test Sarah's resolve, challenge her faith in her community, and ultimately teach everyone involved some hard lessons about the difference between reasonable community standards and authoritarian overreach. The first official complaint arrived on a Tuesday morning in early July, delivered via certified mail in an envelope bearing the official Willowbrook Estates HOA letterhead. Sarah's heart sank as she read the formal language accusing her of violating Section 4.7 of the Community Covenants regarding unauthorized structures and installations. According to the letter signed by Margaret Pemberton in her capacity as Architectural Review Committee chairperson, Sarah's flagpole constituted an unpermitted architectural modification that required prior approval from the HOA board. The letter demanded that Sarah either provide documentation of proper approval or remove the flagpole within 30 days to avoid escalating fines. Sarah was confused and frustrated. She had done her research before installing the flagpole, and nowhere in the community guidelines she had received during the home buying process was there any mention of flagpoles requiring special approval. American flags were specifically protected under both federal and state laws, and she had been careful to ensure her display complied with all relevant regulations. Determined to resolve this amicably, Sarah decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to address the issue directly. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building tucked behind the neighborhood's small lake. Sarah arrived early, armed with copies of federal flag protection laws, state statutes, and documentation showing that several other homes in the neighborhood displayed flags without any apparent issues. What she encountered at that meeting was unlike anything she had expected. Margaret dominated the proceedings from the moment they began, speaking with an authority that seemed to intimidate the other board members into silence. When Sarah was finally given the opportunity to address the flagpole issue, Margaret immediately launched into a prepared presentation about maintaining community aesthetics and preventing the neighborhood from becoming cluttered with unauthorized displays. But here's where things started to get really weird. And remember, you're only about 10 minutes into this story, and it gets so much crazier. Margaret had prepared a PowerPoint presentation specifically about Sarah's flagpole. She had taken dozens of photos from multiple angles, created diagrams showing sight lines and visual impact. She even included what she called property value impact studies that supposedly showed how excessive patriotic displays could negatively affect home prices. Sarah sat in stunned silence as Margaret clicked through slide after slide, treating her American flag like it was some neighborhood blight. Other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure how to respond to Margaret's presentation. Several residents in attendance began whispering among themselves, and Sarah could see looks of confusion and disbelief on their faces. When Sarah finally got her chance to respond, she calmly presented her research about flag protection laws and pointed out that her display was completely legal and appropriate. She mentioned her family's military service and explained the personal significance of the flag. She even offered to work with the board to address any reasonable concerns about the installation. Margaret's response was swift and cutting. She dismissed the federal and state protections as irrelevant to private community standards and insisted that the HOA's covenants superseded any external regulations. She claimed that allowing one unauthorized display would open the floodgates to all manner of inappropriate installations. She suggested that Sarah was being deliberately confrontational by refusing to comply with community standards. The meeting ended with the board voting, reluctantly it seemed, to uphold Margaret's determination that the flagpole violated community covenants. Sarah was given an additional 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines starting at $50 per day. As Sarah left the meeting, several neighbors approached her privately to express their support and their own frustration with Margaret's increasingly controlling behavior. She learned that Margaret had been systematically targeting various homeowners for increasingly minor violations. A family was fined for having a basketball hoop that was supposedly 3 inches too close to the street. Another homeowner was cited for having flower boxes that were the wrong shade of brown, and one elderly veteran was forced to remove a small memorial garden dedicated to his late wife because it didn't fit Margaret's vision of appropriate landscaping. Sarah was beginning to realize that this wasn't really about her flagpole at all. This was about Margaret's need to exert control over every aspect of the neighborhood, and the American flag had become her latest target. But if Margaret thought Sarah would quietly fold under pressure, she had seriously underestimated her opponent. Instead of removing the flagpole, Sarah decided to fight back. She hired a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and property rights. She researched every aspect of the community's governing documents. She discovered several important facts that would later prove crucial. The HOA's original covenants made no mention of flagpole restrictions. The architectural review process Margaret was citing had been added in a poorly documented amendment years earlier, and most importantly, federal law explicitly protected the right to display the American flag in residential communities. When Sarah's attorney sent a detailed legal response to the HOA board explaining why their demands were legally unenforceable, Margaret's reaction was swift and escalatory. Within days, Sarah received another certified letter, this one claiming that her defiant attitude and refusal to comply with community standards constituted harassment of board members and disruption of community harmony. But Margaret wasn't just content with sending angry letters. She began what could only be described as a surveillance campaign against Sarah's property. Neighbors reported seeing Margaret driving past Sarah's house multiple times per day, often stopping to take photos or videos. Margaret started showing up at Sarah's workplace, the local hospital, asking to speak with her supervisors about her neighborhood violations. She even began calling Sarah's references from when she had applied for her mortgage, trying to dig up any information that might be used against her. The harassment was becoming so obvious and persistent that Sarah's neighbors started taking notice. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street, began keeping a log of Margaret's drive-bys and photo sessions. The Johnsons, who lived next door, installed a security camera that happened to capture Margaret trespassing on Sarah's property one evening to get better angles for her documentation. And then Margaret made the decision that would ultimately lead to her downfall. She decided to involve law enforcement. The first police call came on a hot Thursday afternoon in August. Sarah was at work when her neighbor called to let her know that 2 patrol cars had pulled up to her house, and officers were examining her flagpole. When Sarah rushed home during her lunch break, she found the officers looking confused and slightly embarrassed. The senior officer explained that they had received a complaint about an illegal structure and possible code violations. Still, after examining the flagpole and reviewing the relevant laws, they found no violations of any municipal codes. In fact, the officer, himself a veteran, seemed genuinely puzzled about why anyone would complain about a properly displayed American flag. Margaret, however, was just getting started. Over the next 4 months, she would call the police 11 more times about Sarah's flagpole, each time with increasingly creative and desperate complaints. She called to report the flagpole as an unauthorized antenna that might interfere with emergency communications. She claimed it was a traffic hazard because drivers might be distracted by the flag. She suggested it might be a weapons storage facility because flagpoles could theoretically be used to hide things. She even called to report that the flag's movement in the wind was causing her emotional distress and creating a hostile living environment. Each time, the responding officers became more frustrated with what they clearly recognized as harassment and a waste of police resources. The department began documenting Margaret's calls as potentially frivolous, and several officers made informal comments to Sarah expressing their support for her right to display the flag. But Margaret's campaign wasn't limited to police calls. She began organizing what she called community awareness meetings, essentially gatherings where she would try to turn other homeowners against Sarah. She created and distributed flyers with photos of Sarah's house, claiming that aggressive displays of nationalism were dividing the community and threatening property values. The irony, of course, was that Margaret's own behavior was becoming the real threat to community harmony. Neighbors were growing tired of her constant drama and increasingly uncomfortable with her obvious targeting of a woman whose only crime was displaying the American flag on her own property. Sarah was holding up remarkably well under the pressure, but the stress was definitely taking its toll. She was spending thousands of dollars on legal fees, dealing with regular police visits to her home, and constantly having to defend her basic right to express her patriotism. Her work performance was suffering because she was frequently interrupted by Margaret's various complaints and investigations. But Sarah had one advantage that Margaret hadn't counted on. She was absolutely, unequivocally in the right, both legally and morally. And as Margaret's behavior became more extreme and desperate, it was becoming clear to everyone involved that this wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about one person's inability to accept that she could not control every aspect of her neighbors' lives. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would expose Margaret's true nature and ultimately bring her reign of HOA terror to a very public and very embarrassing end. The breaking point came on a crisp October morning when Margaret made what would prove to be her most catastrophic mistake yet. After months of failed attempts to force Sarah to remove her flagpole through official channels, police complaints, and community pressure, Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. It was 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday when Sarah's security camera, which she had installed after Margaret's trespassing incidents, captured something that would change everything. Margaret's silver BMW pulled into Sarah's driveway, and Margaret got out, carrying a large pair of bolt cutters and what appeared to be a cordless reciprocating saw. Margaret had apparently decided that if she couldn't force Sarah to remove the flagpole through proper channels, she would remove it herself. The security footage shows Margaret approaching the flagpole with determined confidence, clearly believing that she was finally going to solve her flag problem once and for all. She spent several minutes examining the base of the pole, trying to figure out the best way to cut it down without damaging the surrounding landscaping, because even in her moment of criminal destruction, Margaret was still obsessed with maintaining appearances. But Margaret had made a critical error in timing. Sarah worked the night shift at the hospital and was arriving home from her 12-hour shift when she spotted the familiar silver BMW in her driveway. As she parked her car and walked toward her front door, she could see Margaret kneeling next to the flagpole with power tools spread around her. The confrontation that followed was captured entirely on Sarah's security system, and the footage would later become crucial evidence in multiple legal proceedings. Sarah called out to Margaret, asking what she was doing on private property with destructive tools. Margaret's response was both shocking and revealing. She stood up, still holding the bolt cutters, and declared that she was removing an illegal structure and protecting the neighborhood from Sarah's defiant behavior. When Sarah told Margaret to leave her property immediately and threatened to call the police, Margaret actually laughed. She said the police were tired of dealing with Sarah's violations and wouldn't respond to her calls anymore. Margaret genuinely believed that her months of frivolous police reports had somehow convinced law enforcement that she was the reasonable party in this dispute. She was spectacularly wrong. Sarah immediately called 911, reporting criminal trespassing and attempted destruction of property. While waiting for the police to arrive, she continued recording Margaret, who had apparently decided that since she was already there, she might as well finish what she had started. The footage shows Margaret attempting to use the reciprocating saw to cut through the flagpole's base, completely ignoring Sarah's demands that she stop. Margaret was so focused on her destruction project that she didn't notice the police cars arriving until officers were walking across the lawn toward her. What happened next was like something out of a comedy movie, except it was all too real. The first officer on the scene was Sergeant Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who had personally responded to several of Margaret's previous complaints about the flagpole. When he saw Margaret kneeling next to the pole with a power saw in her hands and metal shavings scattered around the base, his expression shifted from professional neutrality to barely contained anger. Margaret's reaction to the police arrival was the most revealing moment of the entire saga. Instead of showing any recognition that she might be in the wrong, Margaret stood up. She began lecturing the officers about Sarah's ongoing violations and her own authority as an HOA board member to enforce community standards. Sergeant Rodriguez later testified that in his 15 years of police work, he had rarely encountered such a complete disconnect between someone's perception of their actions and the reality of their situation. Here was Margaret, literally caught red-handed, attempting to destroy someone else's property, trying to convince the police that she was the victim and that they should be arresting Sarah instead. The body camera footage from that morning shows Margaret becoming increasingly agitated as the officers explained that she was under arrest for criminal trespassing, attempted destruction of property, and misuse of emergency services. She demanded to speak to their supervisor, insisted that they didn't understand HOA law, and even suggested that Sarah had somehow manipulated them into taking her side. But the officers had dealt with Margaret for months at this point, and they had already reached their own conclusions about who was the problem in this neighborhood dispute. As Margaret was being placed in handcuffs, Still lecturing the officers about property values and community standards, more squad cars arrived. It turned out that several neighbors had also called 911 after seeing Margaret's BMW in Sarah's driveway at dawn and hearing the sound of power tools. Mrs. Chen from across the street had been watching the entire incident unfold from her living room window and had recorded much of it on her phone. The Johnsons next door had heard the saw and had called the police, thinking someone was breaking into Sarah's house. Even Mr. Hartwell from 3 houses down had called to report suspicious activity involving Margaret's car. The neighborhood had rallied around Sarah in a way that Margaret clearly hadn't expected. As Margaret was being led to the patrol car, she made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the narrative. She announced loudly enough for all the neighbors to hear that she was being arrested for trying to protect the community and that Sarah's aggressive nationalism was destroying the neighborhood's character. The irony was lost on no one. Margaret was being arrested for literally trying to destroy something while claiming to protect the community. But the most damaging moment for Margaret's reputation came when Sergeant Rodriguez asked her directly why she had made 12 separate police reports about a legally displayed American flag. Margaret's response, captured on multiple body cameras and witness phones, was a rambling explanation about how American flags were too political for a refined neighborhood and how excessive displays of patriotism made people uncomfortable. In a community where several residents were veterans, where multiple houses displayed flags on holidays, and where patriotism was generally viewed as a positive value, Margaret's words landed like a bomb. She had finally revealed what many neighbors had suspected all along. This was never about HOA rules or property values. This was about Margaret's personal discomfort with American patriotism and her belief that she had the right to control how her neighbors expressed their love of country. The arrest scene attracted a crowd of neighbors, many of whom were hearing Margaret's true feelings about American flags for the first time. Several veterans in the community were particularly upset by her comments. Mrs. Patterson, whose son had been killed in Afghanistan, was visibly shaken by Margaret's dismissive attitude toward flag displays. As Margaret's BMW was towed from Sarah's driveway and Margaret herself was driven away in the back of a patrol car, the neighborhood was buzzing with conversations about what they had just witnessed. Many residents admitted that they had been intimidated by Margaret's aggressive HOA enforcement, but had been afraid to speak up. Others revealed their own experiences with Margaret's harassment and control tactics. The attempted flagpole destruction had done more than just result in Margaret's arrest. It had finally exposed her true nature to the entire community and galvanized neighborhood opposition to her reign of HOA terror. But the legal consequences for Margaret were beginning, and Sarah was about to discover that her months of careful documentation and legal preparation were about to pay off in ways she hadn't even imagined. The aftermath of Margaret's arrest sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Estates that would reshape the community for years to come. Within hours of the incident, security camera footage and witness videos were circulating throughout the neighborhood, social media, and eventually local news outlets. Sarah, who had spent months being portrayed by Margaret as a troublemaker and rule breaker, suddenly found herself cast in an entirely different light. As the victim of an escalating harassment campaign that had culminated in attempted property destruction. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Months of documentation, police reports, witness statements, and now video footage of Margaret literally trying to cut down an American flag. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Margaret was charged with criminal trespassing, attempted destruction of property, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. Her attorney tried to argue that she had been acting in her official capacity as an HOA board member. Still, this defense fell apart quickly when prosecutors demonstrated that the HOA had no legal authority to destroy homeowners' property, and that Margaret's actions were clearly criminal regardless of any perceived authority. The criminal case became a local news sensation, partly because of its inherent absurdity, a woman arrested for trying to cut down an American flag, and partly because it exposed the broader issue of HOA overreach that resonated with homeowners throughout the region. Local television stations ran segments about Margaret's 12 police calls, her harassment campaign, and the ultimate arrest, painting a picture of HOA power gone completely off the rails. But the criminal charges were just the beginning of Margaret's legal troubles. Sarah, with the support of her attorney and the encouragement of her neighbors, filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against both Margaret personally and the HOA as an organization. The lawsuit alleged harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, violation of civil rights, and abuse of process. Sarah's legal team had done their homework, and they had documentation for everything. During the discovery process, Sarah's attorneys uncovered a treasure trove of evidence that revealed the true extent of Margaret's obsession with controlling the neighborhood. Margaret's personal files contained hundreds of photos of various neighbors' properties, detailed notes about violations that existed only in her imagination, and even maps showing which houses she considered problematic. Most damaging of all, investigators found that Margaret had been using her position on the HOA board to enforce rules against homeowners selectively she personally disliked, while ignoring identical violations by residents who stayed in her good graces. This pattern of discriminatory enforcement undermined any claim that her actions were motivated by genuine concern for community standards. The depositions in the civil case revealed Margaret's true mindset in stark detail. Under oath, Margaret admitted that she found American flag displays vulgar and aggressive. She testified that she believed neighborhoods should maintain sophisticated aesthetics rather than obvious, patriotic displays. Most shockingly, she acknowledged that she had specifically targeted Sarah because Sarah had refused to be intimidated during their first encounter. These depositions became public records, and excerpts were soon circulating throughout the community and beyond. Margaret's own words demolished any remaining sympathy for her position. They confirmed what many neighbors had suspected. This had always been about personal control and Margaret's own biases, not about legitimate community concerns. Meanwhile, the HOA board was dealing with its own crisis. Other board members, who had reluctantly gone along with Margaret's determinations out of misplaced loyalty or intimidation, were now facing legal exposure and community backlash. Several board members resigned in the wake of Margaret's arrest, claiming they had been unaware of the extent of her harassment campaign. An emergency election was called to replace the departed board members, and the community turnout was unprecedented. Neighbors who had never previously engaged with HOA politics showed up to vote, determined to prevent future abuse of power. Margaret was removed from her position as Architectural Review Committee chairperson, and new board members were elected on a platform of reasonable enforcement and respect for homeowners' rights. The new HOA board's first official act was to apologize to Sarah publicly and to clarify that American flag displays were welcome in the community and would never again be subject to harassment or frivolous enforcement actions. They also implemented new procedures to prevent individual board members from launching personal vendettas against homeowners. But perhaps the most satisfying resolution came when Margaret's own HOA violations were finally scrutinized. During the legal proceedings, it emerged that Margaret's own property contained several technical violations of community covenants that she had ignored while obsessively targeting her neighbors. Her elaborate landscaping included non-native plants that violated environmental guidelines, her fence height exceeded community standards in several locations, and her outdoor lighting violated dark sky provisions that she had aggressively enforced against other homeowners. The new HOA board, following Margaret's own precedent for strict enforcement, fined Margaret for each of these violations. When Margaret protested that these were minor technical issues that shouldn't be subject to penalties, the board noted that this was the same argument that many of her victims had made arguments that Margaret had dismissed as attempts to avoid accountability. The criminal case concluded with Margaret pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for community service, restitution to Sarah for legal fees and property damage, and a restraining order preventing her from contacting Sarah or interfering with her property. Margaret was also required to attend anger management counseling and was banned from serving in any HOA leadership capacity for 5 years. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for a substantial sum that not only compensated Sarah for her legal expenses and emotional distress, but also sent a clear message about the consequences of HOA harassment. Part of the settlement included a public apology from Margaret acknowledging that her actions were inappropriate and that Sarah had every right to display the American flag on her property. But the impact of this story extends far beyond the immediate legal consequences for Margaret and the resolution of Sarah's flagpole dispute. The case became a catalyst for HOA reform discussions throughout the region and beyond. Legal experts used it as an example of how HOA power can be abused when oversight is lacking and when individual board members are allowed to pursue personal agendas under the guise of community enforcement. Sarah's story inspired other homeowners who had been subjected to similar harassment to speak up and fight back. Several copycat lawsuits were filed against abusive HOA board members in neighboring communities, and new legislation was proposed to strengthen protections for homeowners' rights within HOA communities. The experience transformed the Willowbrook Estates community itself. Neighbors who had been afraid to express themselves or make improvements to their properties because of fear of Margaret's retaliation suddenly felt free to personalize their homes and engage with community life. Property values actually increased in the months following Margaret's removal from power, contradicting her claims that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain home prices. Sarah's flagpole still stands proudly in her front yard, and it has become something of a neighborhood symbol, not just of patriotism, but of the importance of standing up to bullies and defending individual rights against authoritarian overreach. Other neighbors have installed their own flagpoles and patriotic displays, and the community now celebrates Flag Day with a neighborhood-wide celebration that would have given Margaret nightmares. Margaret herself eventually moved away from Willowbrook Estates, unable to rebuild her reputation or her relationships with neighbors who had witnessed her true nature during the flagpole saga. Her departure was met with relief rather than sadness, and the community quickly moved forward with a more collaborative and respectful approach to neighborhood governance. For Sarah, the experience was both traumatic and transformative. She learned that sometimes doing the right thing requires tremendous personal cost and persistence, but she also discovered that communities can rally around justice when the truth is clearly presented. Her legal victory became a source of pride not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of petty authoritarianism. The story of Sarah's flagpole and Margaret's obsession serves as a powerful reminder that freedom and rights are not abstract concepts. They require active defense by ordinary people who refuse to be intimidated or silenced. It demonstrates that even the most seemingly powerful bullies can be held accountable when their victims dare to stand up and fight back. Most importantly, it shows that the American flag represents more than just national symbols. It represents the principles of liberty, justice, and individual rights that make stories like this possible. In a country where homeowners can successfully challenge authority, where the legal system protects victims of harassment, and where communities can come together to defend what's right, the flag flying over Sarah's house stands for something real and meaningful. As you think about this story, consider the broader implications. How many Margaret Pembertons are there in HOA communities across the country? How many homeowners are currently being harassed for expressing their values or personalizing their properties? How many communities are being held hostage by individuals who mistake authority for wisdom and control for leadership? Sarah's victory wasn't just about one flagpole in one neighborhood. It was about the eternal struggle between individual freedom and authoritarian control played out in the most American of settings. A suburban community where neighbors are supposed to look out for each other rather than tear each other down. The next time you see an American flag flying in someone's yard, remember Sarah's story. Remember that sometimes the most patriotic act isn't displaying the flag itself, but defending the principles it represents against those who would use power and position to silence their neighbors' voices. And if you ever find yourself facing your own Margaret Pemberton, remember that bullies count on their victims staying silent and isolated. Sarah's triumph came not just from her legal strategy or her documentation, but from her refusal to be intimidated and her community's ultimate decision to stand with justice over convenience. The flag still flies proudly over Willowbrook Estates, and it always will, not because an HOA board allows it, but because in America, some rights are simply non-negotiable.